Good evening. Buenas noches. On behalf of Mitchell Kaplan and everyone at Books and Books, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's virtual author event, presented in collaboration with Miami Book Fair, Lit Hub, and Culture Crusaders. I want to give a shout out to members of South Florida's Prologue Society who are watching tonight. If you're interested in history, you should check out the Prologue Society website for more information about the presentations in partnership with Books and Books, Miami Today, and the University of Miami. But tonight's tonight, and tonight we're celebrating Howard Blum's wildly engaging and cinematic Night of the Assassins, the untold story of Hitler's plot to kill FDR, Churchill, and Stalin. The acclaimed New York Times best-selling author here reveals how, in 1943, the big three Allied leaders met for the first time in Tehran to plan the 10-day invasion of Europe, and how, upon learning of the meeting, the Nazis put together a team under the command of an SS major commonly known as the most dangerous man in Europe to devise and execute a plan to assassinate them. Two things separate all of Blum's books from the fray. First, they read with the urgency and intelligence of our most sophisticated historical thrillers. Second, as the very best histories do, they resonate to chilling effect, serving as much-needed cautionary tales. Howard Blum is the author of the New York Times bestseller and Edgar Award winner, American Lightning, as well as Wanted, The Gold of Exodus, Gangland, The Floor of Heaven, and most recently, a 2018 New York Times notable book, In the Enemy's House. While a reporter at the New York Times, he was twice nominated for a Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting. Blum is a contributing editor at Vanity Fair and a frequent co-op contributor to The Hill, writing on history's ties to contemporary events. Howard will be flying solo this evening, but I'll be back after his presentation to pose some questions to him from the audience. So please remember to write them in at the bottom of the screen where it says, ask a question. I'll take a moment to remind you that you can order Night of the Assassin by clicking the button on the screen below. Every order supports your locally owned independent bookstore, Books and Books, and helps us to stay in business. So thank you. And now, without further ado, let's welcome Howard Blum.
Thank you, Christina. Last year, when I was writing In the Enemy's House and also Night of the Assassins, remember last year, it seems like a lot longer than a year ago, before Zoom, before sequestering, part of a previous lifetime, but I won't digress. Last year, when I was working on Night of the Assassins, I spent a lot of time reading about World War II. I would try to put myself in the shoes of the people I was reading about. I would wonder, could I have made the choices that they had to make to protect one's family, to protect myself? Could I have found the perseverance, the fortitude, the courage to get through events? There I'd be in this room where I am now, where I wrote my book. If you hear noises in the background, those are not horns, those are frogs croaking away from my pond. It's a bucolic hilltop in Connecticut. Hopefully there's not going to be a thunderstorm and it'll stay nice and bucolic. But when I was up here writing, I would spend a good deal of my time wishing I could understand what it was like to live in World War II, wishing I could find the empathy, the understanding to convey on the page what it's like to live with a constant sense of uncertainty, what it's like to live not knowing what's going to happen next, what it's like to live through a great unknown. Well, now it's a previously unimagined year later, and all I can say is, be careful what you wish for. Now, I'm not saying that our battle against the pandemic is the same as fighting World War II. There's not another nation trying to conquer us. There's not another nation trying to take our treasure, trying to replace our philosophy with its own. But we are in a fight for our lives, and we're in a fight for our country's future to see how America can get through this crisis, and will it persevere, how it will adapt. And central to both World War II and today, to our navigating these problems, we turn to our leaders. We look to them to ensure that we can manage today, that we still have jobs, paychecks will come in, and we look to them to the future to ensure that America will persevere and that America can adapt to the challenges that we'll face in the years ahead. Today, I think more than ever, we can understand how important leadership is to a nation in a time of crisis. The story I want to tell tonight is a story from World War II, a previously largely unknown story about how the three Allied leaders, FDR, Churchill, and Stalin, were suddenly put in harm's way. It's a story about Hitler's realization that he could come up with a secret plot. Hitler came to the conclusion that he was losing on the battlefield, but there was some way out of this, some desperation strategy that could help the Reich. And he came up with a secret plan, a secret mission. The mission to target the three Allied leaders, FDR, Churchill, and Stalin, at the Tehran conference. The assassins, a specially trained team of SS commandos, headed by the man the Allies identified as the most dangerous man in Europe. The stakes, well, they were nothing less than the future of the world. And one man, Mike Riley, the 33-year-old head of FDR's Secret Service detail, had to thwart these assassins. He had to find the ingenuity and the courage to prevent an assassination that could have changed the course of history. It's a story that has its roots really in January 1943 at the Casablanca Conference. Here in North Africa, FDR and Churchill were meeting, and on the final day of the conference, January 24th, 1943, FDR made a statement to the press, his final press conference at the Casablanca Conference, that surprised Churchill, took him totally by surprise. FDR announced that the Allies will fight until the unconditional surrender of of the Nazis, Japan, and Italy. Once this condition was laid down, once this statement about unconditional surrender was made, the Nazis realized that all their previous plans had suddenly turned into sand. At this point in the war, most of the Nazi high command had come to the realization that the war could not be won on the battlefield. They had lost at Stalingrad, the Allies had invaded North Africa, America was coming into the war with troops, with airplanes. The Nazis, however, were now going to engage in a very pragmatic endgame strategy. They hoped they could snatch a stalemate from the jaws of defeat. By that, they believed they would get a negotiated peace. They could work a peace with the Allies to stop the fighting, and in this peace, they would be able to keep their territories that they had won in Eastern Europe, and the Reich would be able to survive. But now that FDR had announced that there would be an unconditional surrender, they realized that was impossible. They realized that ultimately they would have to answer to an Allied war crime tribunal. They would stand before the court and they would have to pay for their crimes against humanity, their extermination of the Jews, their attacks against civilians. And the court, they knew, would find them guilty and they would pay with their lives. And the Nazi leadership was also students of history. They knew the last time in history an ultimatum such as this, an unconditional surrender, had been given, was when Rome fought Carthage. And Rome said Carthage must be destroyed, and Carthage was destroyed. And that's what they realized would happen to Germany too, unless something could be done. And so on a July evening in 1943, two men walked into the Eden Hotel on Budapest Street in Berlin, and they walked past the bar and they went into a private room. The bar at the Eden Hotel is usually filled with intrigues. They have what are called taxi dancers. These were young boys, teenagers and younger, who would get paid a couple of marks to dance with the war widows or women whose boyfriends or husbands were away fighting. And this was usually the only intrigues that went on in the hotel. But that evening in July, in the back room, the two of the Nazis' top spy masters met in secret. The two men were the head of the SS Section 6, that's the SS's cloak and dagger operations. This was General Walter Schellenberg. He was 33 years old, more a bureaucrat, not really a dyed-in-the-wool Nazi, a pragmatic man. And the man he met with was old enough to be his father. He was Admiral Wilhelm Karnassus. And Karnassus was the head of the traditional military intelligence in Germany, the Abwehr. And the two men wanted to talk, not in the offices, not officially, but to begin to discuss an impossible mission, how they could target the three Allied leaders, since the Allies had been talking about having a conference. And immediately as their discussion began, they realized the problems they faced. One, while the Allies had said they wanted to meet together, no meeting had been planned, there was no date that was known, no location had been set, and even if a date had been set and a location had been determined, the Allies were not revealing this. This was one of the greatest secrets of the war, and the two German spy masters wondered if they'd be able to get this information through their spy networks. The second problem, well, the Allies commanded between the three of them the greatest standing army in the world, over 20 million men. They would certainly be heavily guarded wherever they decided to meet. And that brought up the third problem. They need a plan. With such protection, a frontal assault would be a suicide mission. And if they didn't know where they would meet or when, how could they sneak up on them and make a strategic plan? So these problems were unresolved. Yet at the same time, the two German spy masters resolved to see if they could move forward with an operation they now called Long Jump. That would be the plot to kill the three Allied leaders. And then on September 12th, 1943, just 8 weeks later or so, something happened that gave them hope. Another impossible mission succeeded. On this afternoon of September 12th, 1943, 12 gliders flew down out of the sky above a 7,000-foot Italian mountain. They had come to rescue Mussolini, and the man leading them was SS Captain Otto Scorsenzi. Now, Otto Scorsenzi was a fascinating figure, totally ruthless, a dyed-in-the-wool Nazi. He had a dueling scar in his cheek that he was very proud of, and he was a very inventive commando. He headed the SS's Special Operations School at Orienberg, just outside Sachsenhausen concentration camp, and he was totally dedicated. Hitler came to him and said, I want you to lead a mission to get Mussolini out of the hands of the Italians who are imprisoning him. Benito Mussolini, the Italian dictator, the strutting dictator, had been, as the war was turning against Italy, stripped of his powers by the Italian government, King Victor Emmanuel, and they had put him in this mountaintop fortress, and they kept him there. So they just were until they made up their decision what to do with him. Now, Scorsenzi looked at this problem he had been given by Hitler, and it was very daunting. The only way up the mountain was one single cable car up these 7,000 feet, and it was surrounded by a battalion of Italian troops. You couldn't storm it. You couldn't drop paratroopers out of the sky because at 7,000 feet, the winds would blow them off the mountaintop. And the mountaintop was just a small area. There was no field. It was filled with rocks. You couldn't land a plane. So he came up with this idea of coming in with gliders. And 12 of them flew down out of the sky on September 12th. 5 of them made it. The other 7 were blown off course or crashed. But 5 gliders came in on the mountaintop. Scorsenzi leads his men to the fortress where Mussolini is hidden. The Italians give up without much of a fight. And 3 nights later, there's Scorsenzi bringing Mussolini to Hitler at Hitler's hideout, the Wolfenschanze, in East Prussia. And Hitler's overjoyed. Scorsenzi gets promoted to major. He gets an Iron Cross. And he afterwards takes Scorsenzi aside and tells him, I want you to head Operation Long Jump. The operation, this another impossible mission to target the 3 Allied leaders. Scorsenzi takes this challenge. He's now famous throughout the world. The Allied press is calling him the most dangerous man in Europe. He assembles his team, he trains them, but he still has a major problem. He doesn't know where or when or even if this meeting between the big 3 is going to take place. Oddly enough, in the fall of 1943, that's the same problem that's facing FDR. And on November 2nd, FDR calls into the Oval Office Mike Riley, the head of his Secret Service detail, and gives him a special mission. He wants Mike Riley to find out if a meeting's going to take place. Now, Mike Riley is really the hero of my story, of Night of the Assassins. He gets the job in charge of FDR security at 31 years old. He's a former college football star in Montana. He takes the job 2 days after Pearl Harbor, and he's immediately overwhelmed. He describes himself as an Irish cop with more brawn than brains, which is a little self-deprecating. But the obstacles that he faced were tremendous. I mean, this was the first war where the enemy could fly its bombers across the oceans and bomb Washington, D.C., where paratroopers could drop out of the sky on the White House lawn. And there was something else that made guarding Roosevelt such a challenge. FDR was quite literally a sitting target. He was paralyzed from the waist down. He couldn't move. And Mike Riley knew that if FDR would ever get in the crosshairs of an assassin, Mike would have to put his body in front of FDR. And he was willing to do this. He would have to take the bullet. He called FDR with great affection and respect the boss, and the 2 were quite close. So this morning on November 2nd, FDR tells him, I want you to go to Manara Airport in Marrakesh, Morocco, and you're going to meet someone. And he's going to give you the information about whether or not there is a meeting with Stalin and where it's going to take place. And if it is going to take place, well, then you better go check it out. FDR was sort of the spy master in chief. He liked these little intrigues. And 4 days later, Mike, his guy from a little silver mining town in Montana, is standing underneath a palm tree at the airport in Morocco. And a car pulls up, and there are 2 soldiers in the front seat. And as been prearranged, the soldiers get out. Mike walks slowly so he doesn't attract attention to the car, gets in the back door is open, and there he finds the agent he's supposed to meet who has the information, and it's Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State. It seems the Secretary of State has just been in Moscow for the past 5 days, and he's been meeting with Stalin to see if they can work out a plan for this meeting. And Cordell Hull turns to Mike and says, it's done. It's going to be in Tehran. Stalin has agreed to Tehran. When Mike hears this, he immediately has 2 thoughts. The first is he has to get to Tehran right away and scope out the place. And the second thought is, where is Tehran? He has to go looking for a map. He had no idea what country it was even in. Meanwhile, As Mike is finding out where this meeting of the big three is taking place and when, the Germans are finding it out too at approximately the same time, and they find it out through a spy. The spy is a walk-in. A walk-in is an interesting operative in the intelligence circles. Everyone dislikes him. He comes to you bearing gifts that you haven't asked for, and you don't know why he's bringing you this information. Is it ego? Is it money? Is he a loose cannon? Or what makes spy agencies the most suspicious, the most wary, is he a double agent? Is he bringing disinformation, trying to send you off on the wrong path? And into the German embassy in Ankara, Turkey, a man comes, he's about 5'3", and he says he's the valet for the British ambassador. And each night when the British ambassador goes to sleep, he has the key to the British ambassador's safe, and he can get decoded cables and diplomatic traffic. And for each time he makes a delivery, he wants 20,000 British pounds. 20,000 British pounds is worth about $1 million today. It's a fortune. And the Germans can't quite make up their mind what to do. Can they trust this guy or not? And he's asking for a lot of money. Finally, Schellenberg, the head of the SS Special Cloak and Dagger operation, decides, well, we'll give him counterfeit money. And they have the SS forgers put together 20,000 pounds. They pay him with this counterfeit money, and they take his documents. And as Schellenberg later writes, they're quite breathtaking. The documents are so good that the spy gets the code name Cicero from the Germans. That's after the famous Roman orator, because his documents spoke, the Germans said, so eloquently. And from these documents, they find out what Mike Riley found out. They know that the big three are meeting in Tehran the last week in November. When Schellenberg and the Nazi high command find this out, they now have two pieces of the puzzle that they can use. They know where and when FDR, Churchill, and Stalin are meeting. But their joy is even greater because of something else. The Allies picked the one city, Tehran, where since the beginning of the war, since 1940, German intelligence has been sending agents into Tehran. They have a network of spies set up. They have safe houses established. They have communication systems. And there's even more than that. Over the past 3 months, Germans have been sending sabotage teams into Iran. They've been parachuting them in. They take off from a secret German base in Crimea, fly over Tehran, jump out of the sky, and then try to sabotage trains carrying Allied materiel that's going to the Russians. And even better than that, the man in charge of this aerial insertion missions is Otto Scorsenzi, the very man who is heading Operation Long Jump. I mean, the German High Command feels that fate has smiled on them. The operational gods have blessed this mission. They will succeed. Meanwhile, Mike has gone to Tehran to check it out. He lands at the airport, and the first thing he sees, the airport in Tehran, there's a big red star. It's controlled by Russian troops, and the Russians are walking around with submachine guns. And as he later says, you know, the Russians may be our allies, but they're not our friends. And he didn't like the idea of FDR being surrounded by submachine gun toting Russians. And then he goes to visit the American embassy where FDR is going to stay. And his fears are a little bit assuaged because there's a high wall, and he figures you can put troops around it, and FDR will be safe. And then he goes to visit the British and Russian embassy. And they're all the way on the other side of town, 4 miles away. And they share a compound with gardens and reflecting pools and large ornate buildings. And Mike realizes that each day, with the meetings and the dinners at night, FDR will be having to travel back and forth, go through the twisting streets of Tehran, where there'll be snipers in a crowd or on a roof or in a window, and he's scared stiff. And then as he tours the city, something else strikes him. something that I think we can all identify with these days. It's an invisible enemy. Tehran is a hot zone. There's typhoid raging through the city. On the streets of the main thoroughfare, the gutters have been carved out. And these gutters are for drinking water, but the Iranians use them to drop their refuge in there. And it's a fetid mess. And typhoid is raging everywhere. And with FDR's immune system is already weakened because of his polio, and Mike is quite fearful. But he then learns that there are 3 places in Iran where they get fresh water: the American embassy, the British embassy, and the Russian embassy. The American engineers, when they came into the country, dug water tunnels from the mountains underneath the city to these embassies. And these water tunnels bring in fresh water daily. And Mike breathes a sigh of relief. It's only later that he will realize how dangerous these water tunnels can be. So 10 days later, the Allies on November 27th come to Tehran. Churchill arrives first and he hopes to sneak in. There's no press involved. It's supposed to be a top secret meeting. And as soon as Churchill gets there, there's a ceremony at the airport. And then on the way into the British embassy, the entire route is lined with Iranian cavalry in comic opera uniforms sitting on top of their mounts. And Churchill later says, at any moment they were showing the way where any assassin could come and get me. And then as he approaches the British embassy, he's in his open-top car, and the car is caught in traffic. And it's for 20 minutes, and he's just sitting there, and he's looking at his watch, and he's scared stiff, he writes. He feels if it had all been planned to put him in the most danger, it couldn't have been more successfully planned. He, of course, is being sarcastic. For Mike Riley and FDR, the operation to get FDR into the city goes without a hitch. FDR arrives at 3 p.m. in his big C-54 airplane. He's taken to the American embassy. He's settled in. He's on the second floor of the American embassy in his bedroom with Mike. And Mike is feeling pretty good about things. And he gets a message. Someone comes to tell him that there's a Russian general downstairs waiting to see him. Mike goes downstairs. It's General Dmitry Arkadyevv, the head of the NKVD, which is the precursor to the KGB, the Soviet Secret Intelligence Service. And Mike assumes that the general is just there to tell him that Stalin has arrived and he's at the Russian embassy. But Mike takes one look at the general's face, at his hangdog eyes, and he realizes something is very wrong. And the Russian general tells him that last night, 38 Nazi commandos came down out of the sky on a mission to kill the Big Three. And Mike, his heart stops, as he describes it in his memoirs. And the first thing he can say that he asks, he realizes a silly question, are you sure there were just 38? And he says, yes, we caught them all and we interrogated them quite thoroughly, as the general explains. And when he says quite thoroughly, Mike has a vision in his mind of what it must have been like to be interrogated quite thoroughly by the NKVD. But he's not really too sorry, because this is wartime and his whole responsibility is to protect the boss. And then the general says, there is something else. We learned from these men that we interrogated that 6 commandos came in on a separate plane. These 6 commandos are at loose in the city, and they have a mission to kill the Big Three, FDR, Churchill, and Stalin. And when Mike heard this, his blood ran cold. And for the next 4 days of the conference, it's a cat and mouse game between Mike Riley overcoming his animosity to work with the Russians, trying to get these 6 commandos, well-trained, well-armed, with their plan in a city of 1 million people. They're going from house to house, through the bazaars, looking for them. And it all comes down to the night of November 30th, Churchill's 69th birthday party. And there's a picture, a photograph in my book. It's the front piece of my book. And you can see FDR, Churchill, and Stalin sitting shoulder to shoulder at this dinner at the British Embassy on that night in Tehran. You can see the birthday cake in front of them. You can almost hear their voices singing happy birthday to Churchill. And at that moment, 6 Nazi assassins are trying to make their way to the water tunnels to sneak into the embassy grounds, break into the dining room, and change history. What happens? Well, how it all works out, you read it in the book. But spoiler alert, I hope this doesn't ruin the book for you. They're not killed, and the Allies win the war. So let me now take you to after the Tehran conference. It's December 17th, 1943. We're in the Oval Office. FDR has just come back from overseas, and he's giving his first press conference to tell the press what happened at Tehran. And he's been talking about the agreements that have been made, and 20 minutes into the conference, and you can hear this, the entire conference, it's been recorded, and it's at the FDR Presidential Library in Hyde Park. You can hear he says, "We had a bit of a security problem. I had to move from the American embassy to stay at the Russian embassy because there were 6 Nazi commandos on the loose." And then he gives a laugh, one of FDR's hearty laughs, and he says, quote, "It would have been a pretty good haul if they could have gotten all 3 of us." And he continues laughing, and the press joins in. And what's most amazing, and again, you can hear it on the recording, FDR then says, "Let me tell you about China." And they go on, and there are no follow-up questions. And for the years after the war, Operation Long Jump, this plot to kill the big 3, was just a vague rumor. From that press conference mentioned in memoirs, there were some interviews by people using pseudonyms who were participants after the war. But then in 2003, the Soviet Secret Intelligence Agency, the SVR, released a treasure trove of classified documents about what happened in Tehran. And they even brought out one of their agents who was just a young man, barely 20 years old at the time, who played a role in stopping the attack with Mike Riley for interviews. And I was able to get a hold of those documents, get them translated, and then I went to memoirs, newspapers, and then went to American archives, British archives, German archives, and put all the pieces together to tell the true story of what happened that week in Tehran, tell the true story of Operation Long Jump. So let me circle back to what I said at the beginning. We are living in a time now, a time of crisis, when we can understand how important leaders are, how we rely on our leaders to get us through this crisis and to lead us into the future and to prepare that future. We count on their leadership where their lack of leadership can be problematic. And we also are living through a time where we've all experienced how life can change just like that. And these experiences that we've had in recent days, I think, make us understand with a chilling sense of immediacy what was at stake, what hung in the balance that night in Tehran when the night of the assassins tried to make their way into Churchill's 69th birthday. Thank you. And if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them, or at least try to.
So it looks like no one has learned how to use the ask a question button at the bottom of the screen because we don't have many, although we do have a lot of people watching. So let's give them a few minutes. If anyone has any specific questions, let's go and ask a question and we'll take those. And in the meantime, what got you interested in writing about this?
Well, I like to tell stories that are true, that historically based, but have been overlooked. And when I heard and read about FDR's press conference and that wasn't ever followed up, that got me intrigued. And yet to make these books work, you need memoirs by all the participants. So you can actually, they can become characters as if in a novel, but it has to be true. For Schellenberg, for Mike Riley, Canarsis, they all had their memoirs written. Even Scorsenzi has 3 memoirs written. And so when I say what they're thinking or what they're feeling, I'm not making that up. When I put quotes around something they've said, that's all from these documents. And had all that information there. And it was a detective work trying to put this all together, and at the same time recreate history and deliver a read where someone can sit on the beach, if we're allowed to go back to the beaches, I'm not sure, and read this book and have an enjoyable afternoon and learn something and get caught up in a drama and see, you know, how close it came to succeeding. That was the most shocking thing to me when I did my research. It was just a matter of fate that it didn't succeed, and that would have changed the course of the world.
So, a question from Laura. Was the 20-year-old Russian someone famous?
Excuse me, the what-year-old Russian?
Was the 20-year-old Russian someone famous?
I'm not sure the 20-year-old Russian who we're referring to, but the Russians used a 20-year-old female spy, which was sort of interesting. The Germans had their spy network in Tehran, and they had the head of the spy network was a man named Franz Meyer, and he had a mistress. This mistress was also sleeping with an American GI trombone player who she met in the jazz band. This trombone player worked for American intelligence, and he also worked with Russian intelligence. So that was the conduit that put all these pieces together.
Okay, here's another one. Did your research lead to future book ideas?
Well, I tried it. One of the great things about being a writer and doing the sort of books I do, it's like going to school and you can learn something new each time. So I try to move on. I stay in the same sort of parameters of narrative nonfiction. I like intelligence stories, and I found something else that happens in 1978. Just to give you a hint, a boat is found floating on Chesapeake Bay in Maryland. There's a radio, which is a flash drive radio to communicate with satellites. It's top secret. There are top secret documents scattered about the deck. There's a little blood on the deck, and there's no one else involved. And that's how the story begins.
Okay. Here is a question. How did the aircraft through Soviet-controlled airspace?
I'm not sure. I'm sort of breaking up which aircraft you mean. FDR's aircraft didn't go through Soviet-controlled airspace. He went first from Cairo, and he took a boat across the Atlantic, the U.S.S. Iowa, our largest battleship, and then from there he flew to Cairo, where he met with Shanghai Shek and Churchill, and then from Cairo he flew into Tehran. Interesting story when he crossed the Atlantic. FDR was on the SS Iowa with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and his cabinet, kitchen cabinet, his advisors. And the captain of this big battleship says, let's have a demonstration for the commander-in-chief. And there are other boats in the flotilla, and they're going to try to shoot down balloons, target balloons. And they're also, one of the boats decides to do an exercise to keep his men sharp. He gets a torpedo drill where he targets the Iowa, that's where FDR and the Joint Chiefs are on, with a dummy torpedo. Except when they shoot it off, It's not a dummy torpedo, it's a live torpedo. And it comes within a yard or so of the bow of the SS Iowa. And we could have lost FDR and the Joint Chiefs before they even got to Tehran. And that was an amazing and fascinating story that intrigued me. Are you there? I sort of lost you. I feel like Joe Biden on this technology here. I hope it's coming through.
I'm here. So I think that's it for tonight's questions. I just want to thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and I appreciate your support of the book. And it was great.
I wish I could say we're now moving into the room next door, and you're going to be signing books. And if everyone would please fold their chairs and follow us, but can't. But I can say that you can purchase Night of the Assassins at Books and Books, and we hope you will. You just hit the purchase button on the bottom of the screen, and we wish you the best of luck with this book. And I hope we'll see you.
I look forward to it. Thank you very much. I appreciate all your kindness. Bye-bye.
Bye.